Welcome back to the Youth Parliament. In this particular Youth Parliament, which is one forum where we try and make sure that India's newsmakers, policymakers, decision makers and opinion makers come face to face with the youth of this country, with Generation Next, to get a sense of what they seek from them and also get a sense of whether the core issues which need to be dealt with by policymakers is dealt with in a way that is meeting the aspirations of India's future. In this particular Youth Parliament, taking off on the broad theme, our subject is foreign policy. Foreign policy which encompasses all areas of strategic affairs. And the motion before the House is very simple. It is, and I say this, quote, India's foreign policy is not in line with our global aspirations. In other words, just to very briefly put it in perspective, we are heading towards a general election, and we constantly have the opposition criticizing the government for a weak foreign policy. India is eyeing a seat at the diplomatic high table as a member of the UN Security Council. But do we and have we shown enough might, courage, and vision in the implementation of our foreign policy? Are there domestic compulsions which hold us back? Have we been aggressive enough? Are we being independent enough in the pursuit of our foreign policy? Have we pushed our growing economic might on the diplomatic high table? These, among others, will be some of the various questions, including our difficult relationship with several of our neighbors, will be some of the subjects which we will be addressing in the course of this extended Youth Parliament. And joining me as my co-moderator, very happy to have with me on this table my friend, colleague, and strategic affairs analyst of Times Now, Maruf Raza. Maruf, what are you looking for? When you look at this subject, can we just give us, our panelists, a sense of what subject areas we are looking to debate?
Yeah, apart from getting on with the broad generalities about issues that really India's interaction with the world and various countries are concerned, I mean, I would ideally look for some pointers towards, are we structurally geared towards playing a role in the global arena? Do we have structural assets in place? The second aspect is that what kind of immediate steps we could look at in terms of focusing what should be our foreign policy priorities. Do we need to begin top-down, which is engaging the big powers first and the smaller neighbors later, or should it be the other way around? And finally, what is our long-term vision about ourselves? Are we looking at India continuing to battle fires and react to situations in the neighborhood, or do we look at an India which would be occupant of a position at the high table of world affairs and becoming an example for other countries outside the P5?
Right. Maruf, thanks for summarizing it. I hope that is useful to our panelists. Now, we have 4 members of what we call the establishment. Please don't get the definition of establishment wrong. It essentially here, in the context of the debate, means people who are already playing a role as opinion makers, policy makers, or decision makers. So we have a representation there. For the motion, Ravi Shankar Prasad, let's give them all a hand. He's Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Rajya Sabha and one of the most vocal members of the Bharatiya Janata Party. And to give him some competition head-on, the Union Minister for Information and Broadcasting, and someone who is very strong on foreign policy and strategic affairs, Manish Tiwari. Thank you very much. We have top-level participation on this debate. And speaking for the motion, one of India's foremost strategic affairs analysts, a man whose independent mind and numerous articles make him one of the foremost experts of the region and the world, Dr. Brahma Chailani. It's a pleasure to see you face-to-face this evening. And you've seen him so many times earlier on our debates on Times Now, the former High Commissioner to Pakistan, very vocal, very independent. Some call him a hawk, but tonight he is actually on the side of the government, or rather, should I say, he says he's against the motion that India's foreign policy is not in line with our global aspirations. G. Parthasarathi, welcome to the debate. Now I want a louder applause for our young participants. And speaking for the motion from GNLU Law University in Ahmedabad is Karmani, 24 years old. Speaking against the motion and for the government, I presume, therefore, though I don't want to make any presumptions with this young man, his name is Sauryadeep, 22 years old from IIT. Sauryadeep. And Tahmi Shahid, 23-year-old from the Shadan Institute of Medical Sciences in Hyderabad, is speaking for the motion. Welcome. And the last young participant to introduce today from the IIIT Bangalore, 20-year-old Raijul, is speaking against the motion. We are opening the debate by requesting our young participants to set the ball rolling. And Tehmi Shahid is our first speaker for the motion on why she believes India's foreign policy is not in line with our global aspirations. Tehmi, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Beginning with what India's global aspirations really are, to summarize them, what we by consensus of the youth feel the global aspirations of the youth would be: one, being an economic power in the world; secondly, attaining a military security that India is a formidable power in our neighborhood; thirdly, protection of the Indian diaspora wherever they are in the world; and lastly, having a global soft power that people can reckon with. Now, these are the global aspirations that the youth of India recognize with, but our foreign policy is certainly not in line with these aspirations, and we say that for several reasons. First and foremost, our foreign policy has failed in prioritizing where we intend to reach first. By this, basically what I mean is that we have not been able to achieve a holistic approach in where we can get to our economic status and our military status hand by hand. We have not been able to achieve that. But the depressing part of this argument is that we have not even been able to prioritize which one we would like to attempt at first, whether it's going towards an economic power or going towards a military security power. And not just by that, by prioritizing, I also mean that we have failed in prioritizing where we intend to see India, as in our neighborhood, do we see India as a militarily secured nation, or towards the world as in India as a growing power? So on both fronts, whether it's economy or military, or in the neighborhood and the world at large, we have failed to prioritize in our foreign policy. Also, this is an argument that has been coming up a lot, that we have failed to seize opportunities in our foreign policy, and this we can say by a lot of our neighboring countries have had governments that are largely pro-India, or they've had softer sentiments towards the Indian people. But we have failed to capitalize on this sentiment and project on a more powerful Indian sentiment, and lost the opportunity, and now we're facing a threat where a more anti-India sentiment can arise in these nations. For example, the best example I could give is Bangladesh, where a more radical kind of a government is threatening to come up. Also, what I would like to talk about is the disconnect that our foreign policy makers seem to have with the defense and intelligence. And I would not like to keep this as a completely anti-UPA kind of an argument, though I would like to also criticize all governments that have basically been making foreign policies irrespective of who they are. In the Kargil war, for example, there have been intelligence reports again and again that there would be an incursion from Kargil, in the Kargil from the Pakistani side, and we have not been able to establish a kind of a connect between our defense, intelligence, and the Ministry of External Affairs. Now, coming to the Ministry of External Affairs, it's extremely sad to say that our Ministry of External Affairs is pretty much the same size as that of Singapore, and Singapore happens to be a very small country. So it's rather a depressing thought for a country that aims to be a global superpower, that our Ministry of External Affairs is so small. And for those people who would, obviously from the defending side, would say that, we are going to look at a glass half full approach by saying that our foreign policy has managed to come up with the Copenhagen and the ASEAN, and also gearing up for the Security Council seat. Let's just be practical a little bit. When we look at our foreign policy through a glass half full approach, what we are basically depriving ourselves of is the chance to criticize ourselves and look at an opportunity to improve. If we are going to be complacent about our foreign policy where it is right now, we're not going to improve any further. And that brings us to our most beloved neighbors, whom we cannot talk about without talking about our foreign policy, is China and Pakistan. Unfortunately, you can pick on your enemies, you can pick on your friends, you can't pick on your neighbors, sadly. So, with China, people say that you can't really compare about the military figures or the strategic figures with China. I think that's not a very healthy argument to make, because we are geostrategically positioned with China in such a way that whether you want to or not, China is an important player in the foreign policy. We have to compare China, and China will likewise compare with us, because both of these countries are looking forward to become a regional power in the Indian subcontinent in the coming time, and it has been projected by 2050. The three of the most powerful countries in the world would be United States of America, China,
Right.
and India. So if we want to be where we are, that is, see our global aspirations come to realization, we have to talk about China, and we have to deal with China in a healthy way. Because what we have done is our foreign policy has failed to capitalize on markets where China is already gaining ground. And by that, I rest my case by saying that our foreign policy is certainly not in line with our global aspirations of India becoming a superpower.
Well, I think you've looked at a very broad perspective. Round of applause for Tahmir Shahid. Now our second speaker is Sauradeep, and he's speaking against the motion.
I'd like to talk about three things, which is firstly, that in terms of timing, we are spot on with our foreign policy because there are certain tools that the government that comes to power post-2014 will have at their disposal, which previous governments haven't had. And secondly, that we have managed to maintain a very delicate strategic balance. And thirdly, that there are certain constraints within the democratic process, which means that oftentimes the strategy, though it may be in line, the execution doesn't go through, and that's a trade-off you're willing to make. But at the very outset, let's be very clear. There are specific mistakes that are made by every country on foreign policy. That is not an indictment of saying that a broad strategy is certainly not in line with our overall goals. So for instance, China had an entire hegemony on the Myanmar market, but they pushed them too far, led to the Mighty Son Dam project being cancelled, and now every country has access to the market in Myanmar. USA made a similar mistake, right? They ended up subsidizing terror in Pakistan in attempting to fighting terror in Afghanistan. Every country makes mistakes. A few mistakes cannot be picked upon by the other bench to extrapolate that into an overall indictment. Now, coming to the aspect of timing, I'm quite certain that this issue will crop up, that we haven't been strong enough or stringent enough against Pakistan. But let's be very clear. We couldn't have done that at a time when the United States had been pumping billions of dollars into a war on terror in which Pakistan was considered a strategic ally. But what have we done? We have ensured a very strategic pivot from being a Soviet ally 20 years back to now reaching a stage where the USA is willing to co-develop next generation Javelin tanks with India, have a huge defense pact with us at the same time as they are pulling out of NATO, which means that post-2014, our next government will have the tool at their disposal to put Pakistan under pressure. So criticizing previous governments on that issue is slightly unfair to begin with, right? What we have also accomplished is a delicate balance. We accrue nuclear submarines from Russia while managing to sign a nuclear peaceful deal with the United States. We are friends with both Palestine and Israel. We have managed to ensure that our trade interests with Egypt do not suffer through transitions from Mubarak to the army, to Mohammed Morsi, and again to the army. And we have managed to maintain our friends in the Middle East, which is really strategically important for us, despite the amount of chaos going there. That's certainly a benefit and certainly an achievement of our strategic policy.
Well, thank you, Sauradeep. Thank you. Well, I'm glad you look at Pakistan only through the American prism. Others will say, is it true that prime ministers since 99 have been guided by their personal conviction in their relationship towards Pakistan? We'll go into those issues in detail, and I'm sure the next speaker will. Ravi Shankar Prasad is our next speaker, speaking for the motion, Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Rajya Sabha. The floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, sir, let me begin with the first confession. What we mean by being a global power and global aspirations. Surely India is a big country, 1.2 billion plus, 65% of India, 35% and below, with a profound aspiration. But we are not sure of our own aspiration. And we need to understand that the road to global power passes through the regional power. And let me begin at the very outset. What is the take of India's foreign policy management as far as the region is concerned? Just to say it in shambles. I'll come to Pakistan and China separately. Anti-India forces are rising in Sri Lanka. There is a sense of unease in Nepal. Afghanistan, with the imminent withdrawal of American forces, is going to be an area of uncertainty. Bangladesh, there is still a great war going between pro-India and anti-India forces. We had such a good relationship with Bhutan, but we behaved in such an irresponsible fashion by cutting on their subsidy of gas. And then we had to restore. I would say that we are not able to handle our regional scenario, and we are talking of global scenario. That is the first thing I would like to highlight. Today, when we are discussing 3 days ago, our Prime Minister met the Pakistani Prime Minister in New York, much against opposition of many people, including myself. All the goody-goody handshake were there, the promises were there, and right today, when we are debating, Pakistani forces, including their terrorists, are attacking Indian posts in a very massive way, almost committing a mini Kargil. What kind of foreign policy is this? Therefore, we are not able to manage properly regional issues we wish to have a global aspiration. The second quick point I would like to make is we need to understand that you can become a good global power if you are also a good military power. Yes, we are proud of our Jawans and officers who are willing to die for India. And as I always say, we all live for India. It is our security forces alone who die for the country. But are we giving our best to them? Today, weapon purchase is in shambles. Decision makings are not being done. All the armory weapon supply is in a serious condition of uncertainty. We all know that. And our forces are repeatedly demanding, be the armed forces, the naval forces, and their forces, that our arsenal needs to be supplemented. The third issue is, to become global, you must have genuine economic aspirations. And to become an economic power, you must have a good economy also. What is the condition of our economy today? I need not go further into that, except to say, if Indians are not willing to invest in India, how would foreigners invest in India? Our trade is declining. Our import-export is declining. New area crying for India's investment is not coming about. That is the third scenario I would like to flag. Where we are lacking also is the proper articulation of India's conventional power, namely India's soft power. India's films, India's television, India's music. Let me ask a question to this August gathering today. What the government is doing for the promotion of these soft power in a very organized way, whatever may be the autonomous initiative of some of the creators, but there is no organized initiative to ensure that India's soft power is properly articulated on the world stage. Let me say in the last, there has to be a leadership also, which can convey this aspiration on the global level. And I seek the indulgence of this House to mention the role of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. When Pokhran 2 happened, the whole world imposed sanction. USA, Germany, Canada, Australia, Japan, and whole lot. And what they wanted? To sign a discriminatory NPT. Mr. Vajpayee said, sorry, it will not be done, it is discriminatory. And ultimately, because of India's big stature, they sought to lift the entire embargo of sanction. We did not succumb. There has to be a leadership. There has to be a performance, economic power. And therefore, Mr. Chairman, I feel that in this way, the whole India's foreign policy management today is not in line with our global aspirations.
Speaking of Vajpayee, you say that you were resolute and they are not. Lahore happened during Vajpayee's time. It was followed by Kargil. Kargil was followed by talks in Agra. Agra was succeeded by the attack on Parliament, and Operation Parakram, Ravi Shankar Prasad, though I'm not getting into this debate, ended without any outcome between December 2011 and August 2002. I'm only before I hand it over, I'm only getting the other side on because I know these issues and others.
All right, I'll wait for my turn to reply to your very sterling queries, Honorable Chairman.
Mr. Prasad, may I just also add that the NPT and resistance to the NPT from India's side happened long before the NDA government came into play, because the NPT was initiated as a body and as an initiative which, and the NSG primarily post our nuclear test of 1974.
Lift the sanction, that was
I think all parties take credit for standing up to the NPT.
And I think Maruf, we should restrain ourselves, which is difficult, Maruf, but we must always try. Anyway, a year after Parakram, your government entered into a ceasefire with Pakistan. So anyway, that's history. We won't go into prehistory. Speaking next against the motion is Manish Tiwari, Union Minister for Information and Broadcasting, to respond to the specific points made by the other side. Floor is yours, sir.
Chairperson, sir. First of all, allow me to commence with a caveat that I speak for myself and not for the government, for the simple reason that it would be inappropriate for me to bind the government to the views that I articulate today. What are India's global aspirations? And I think the answer to that is two-pronged. The promotion, preservation, and protection of our national interest, and B, the consolidation of our strategic autonomy, which has been the defining core of India's foreign policy since 1947. Which brings me to the second question, what is India's national interest? India's national interest at this point in time is to see how do we consolidate our space for consolidation. Over the next 2 decades, India requires space in order to surmount both its internal as well as its economic challenges. And this can be achieved by ensuring that we have tranquility on our periphery. Tranquility on the periphery is achieved by a two-pronged objective. The first is engagement, and the second is to have the capacity to be able to inflict unacceptable damage in case there is a misadventure or even a whisper of a misadventure. When we talk about strategic autonomy is essentially the ability to be able to function with flexibility in a world which is increasingly becoming multipolar, and where on a daily basis the sine qua non is not nation-centric alliances, but issue-centric alliances. And here, allow me to step back a little and take a long view of India's foreign policy. The United States today continues to remain the single biggest outside balancer in each region of the world, consolidating on the next steps in the strategic partnership, which the NDA abandoned. We not only concluded the Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement, but have moved to becoming partners and close partners in defense cooperation. Our relationship with the European Union is marked by cooperation in trade, in foreign direct investment, piracy, combating piracy in the Gulf of Aden, peacekeeping. Yes, we have differences with the doctrine of right to protect, as well as their theology of values. Coming to West Asia, notwithstanding the Arab Spring and the turbulence which the world has witnessed, we have maintained a balance between not only the GCC and Iran, but our presence in the wider Middle East, where in addition to our energy security needs, you have 6 million Indian expats living out there. East Asia, the story is the same. Relationship with Japan, with South Korea, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, and I can go on and so on and so forth, including the multilateral frameworks is better. Which brings me to China. China today is a lonely power. Except for Pakistan and the North, and maybe DPR Korea, it really does not have any friends on its periphery. It's engaged in trying to surmount both its Hormuz and Malacca dilemmas. At the same point in time, we need to engage with China. We are cooperating with them on climate change. We are cooperating with them on oil exploration in, if I remember correctly, southern Sudan and Angola. And which, of course, then brings us to the favorite subject of times now, which is Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is a different case in point. But for the lack of a better word, the Frankenstein foreign policies which were put in place by Pakistan, I've unfortunately recoiled on them very badly. And let me just point to a single statistic which tells a very interesting story. The fatalities from all forms of terror in 2005 in India was 3,259. In Pakistan, it was 648. In 2013, in India, there are 680. In Pakistan, there are 4,634. And these figures are as current as September 29th, 2013. Similarly, with regard to multilateral fora, I will not go into IPSA and I will not go into G20, etc. But since United Nations was raised, on the question of the restructuring of the United Nations, it is not that India doesn't have a seat on the high table. The problem with the restructuring of the United Nations Security Council is not who do you bring in, but who do you keep out. So therefore, as we stand today on the cusp of 2013, we are faced with two interesting realities. 2008 not only marked the global economic meltdown, it was for the first time that a bulk of the world's population got urbanized. 2012 was the first year after the Industrial Revolution when the total global output came from developing countries as opposed to developed countries. So therefore, I would just like to conclude by saying that foreign policy is not a T20 match. It's not a boxing match where punches and counter punches actually determine whether you won or lost. It's more like a game of chess where you need to be mindful of the other pieces on the board. And the UPA, like a very thoughtful grandmaster, I think has steered the course of India's foreign policy in a very succinct but yet consistent manner over the past 10 years.
Well, Manish Tiwari, you've been detailed. You've taken your time. I find it interesting, Mr. Minister, that you refer to a T20 match. Now, the audience later would like to ask you, was the Prime Minister of India considering himself as the opening batsman of a T20 team when he said that it cannot be business as usual with Pakistan after the beheading, and why he has not been consistent with that. You also avoid the references to the incursions in China, and I don't know whether it's part of T20 cricket to describe the incursions of 19 kilometers into China as acne. I'm just laying this out as questions that can be put to the minister, who has deftly, in his own style, kept away from these contentious issues. I'm sure the House will bring him back to it. I have heard many critiques of this government's policies. You restrict it not just to governments, you restrict it to the center across different political groups. You call it soft, confused, escapist, and if I understand you correctly, an unreal foreign policy. This is the strongest critique I have heard. Our next speaker, speaking from GNLU Law University, is Karmanne Thadani, and he's speaking for the motion. Karmanne, go ahead.
Respected members of the August House, we've been having a very interesting debate so far. As I see it, it's becoming, I'm sorry to say, an NDA versus UPA match. That's not really the objective of this debate. But coming to the points raised by side opposition, their fundamental contention has been that there have been significant foreign policy successes India can boast of, the Indo-US nuclear deal being a significant example. Possibly, yes, point taken. There are many debates on the nuclear deal, whether or not it is required, whether or not it is in our best interests. But keeping that aside, if that is taken as a success, fair enough. Our problem, our contention is not that India has had no foreign policy successes. I agree with Mr. Manish Tiwari when he says that analysis of foreign policy cannot be a zero-sum game, wherein you say it's completely successful or a complete failure. But do we wish to see our successes only and celebrate them? Or do we wish to look at where we have failed and how to rectify our problems? As you pointed out, Mr. Goswami, very rightly, Mr. Manish Tiwari failed to mention how we will solve our problem of Chinese incursions, but only mentioned that we are cooperating with them in Copenhagen, we are cooperating with them in terms of trade, and we have to engage with China, which is now a lone power. Sir, it may be a lone power, but it is intruding into our territory. Sir, it may be a lone power, but it tells our INS Airawat warship, not a warship in fact, our ship off the coast of Vietnam to actually go off the South China Sea and claims the whole sea. we may be engaging with others, we may be trying to contain China. How far have we actually succeeded? Speaking of Pakistan, again, as Tahemi pointed out, even the NDA government is responsible. I have a report, a media report, and also a think tank report, which says that 43 intelligence reports were produced between June 1998 and May 1999, saying that there will be a possible intrusion from Pakistan. Now, why did the Kargil war have to take place in the first place? Why could that not be prevented? It's fine to have a bus diplomacy with Pakistan, it's fine to have cultural exchanges, but why cannot we be strong enough? Why can we not be strong enough? Why can we not take a firm stand? Why do we still cooperate with them in trade? Why do we still talk to them? We suspend talks, then we talk again. What purpose does that really serve? If we can't be tough on terror, why are we doing this to ourselves? So I am not an expert, as some people present here are. I speak for the youth, I speak for how we feel. That's all I can claim to do. So that's how we feel. We feel that we do not understand why Ms. Mamata Banerjee's contentions vis-a-vis Bangladesh should actually be taken into consideration by the central government and put India's geostrategic interests at stake. So these are the questions that we have, and we want answers. Thank you.
Let's give the young man a round of applause. Well argued, Karmanei. And you know, if you study Indo-Pakistan relations, you will find this from Havana to Sharm el-Sheikh to Thimphu. Every time there's a grave provocation, there's a lot of anger, there are a few statements, then that subsides, talks resume like nothing ever happened. That's a fact, and I'm glad you're steering the debate in that direction. Now, taking you on from the other side, I think, is Rejul from IIIT Bangalore speaking against the motion. Rejul, floor is yours for 3 minutes.
First, I'd like to respond to a point that Thami made earlier. See, according to you, one of our global aspirations is apparently to protect our diaspora everywhere. Now, I mean, come on, this is a bit of a utopian ideal, right? It's easy to say that, yeah, our country should be able to protect its citizens everywhere. But can we even protect every Indian citizen on our own soil? Forget in other countries. See, let's be realistic here. It's important for us to improve our economic power. It's important for us to improve militarily. But you can't say protection of every Indian citizen everywhere in the world is a benchmark by which you're going to judge our foreign policy. Second of all, responding to both Karmania and Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, you all have talked of Pakistan and how we have talks and then break off talks and stuff. And yeah, everybody's sick and tired of it, so am I. But the point is, really, this is just a lot of hot air. I mean, what are we going to do? What do you really want us to do? You want us to declare war on Pakistan? It's absurd. Okay? None of us want another Kargil. Second of all, what exactly is your stand going to be? It's not necessary that everybody in Pakistan is evil. We've made a bogeyman out of Pakistan.
Everyone is evil.
So what is your attitude? There might be rogue elements in the Pakistani government. There might be elements on the LOC right now. What are we doing? There are elements which might be attacking us and attacking the Indian army. But you can't break off talks with the government for that reason. You can't just say that I'm going to break off every diplomatic relation with this country, have no talks, have no trade or something like that with it. It's absurd. Second of all, if you're talking of the economy and what we've done for our economy, yes, our economy has slowed down, but that's not exactly a foreign policy question. Firstly, it's in part due to the global recession, which is not something we have control over. Second of all, we have taken a lot of steps to try and speed up the economy, and that's something that should be factored in. Militarily speaking, we've collaborated with Russia on the BrahMos missile tech. We've promised to collaborate with America on the next-gen Javelin missiles, as was mentioned earlier. And this is the first time we have a defense agreement wherein they're supplying us with technology as well. This will give us an option to reverse engineer and try to manufacture the arms ourselves. Next up, when we're talking of soft power, you mentioned earlier how Africa is already being invaded by China, so to speak, through this economic route. I don't think that's a reason why India shouldn't also pursue it. Firstly, China is focusing more on resource extraction. India is also focused on a lot of infrastructure projects and has tried to promote development in Africa. This will also provide a market for our goods. Second of all, when you're talking of how we have to accept the fact that we are forced to compete with China, I completely agree with you. This debate is about foreign policy, and in foreign policy, you have to accept certain constraints. You have to accept that right now, China's economy is bigger than ours. That doesn't mean that we are necessarily a weaker country than China. For example, even America admits that our Navy is on par with NATO standards, and our Navy is in fact stronger than China, which is something we should monopolize on. But it is important to realize that even if there are some respects in which we cannot compete with China, there are others in which we can and in which we should, moreover. Also, you raised the point about Mamata Banerjee and how domestic compulsions sometimes force our hand in foreign policy, so to speak. I completely agree with you. I think that the center is the sole one who should have a say in foreign policy. However, remember this, we're a democracy. And though it's true that we do have to allow Mamata Banerjee sometimes for some strange reasons, even people like her, to force our hand on issues like Bangladesh, it's also the very same democracy that allows us both to sit here and criticize that on this forum.
Okay.
And I think that's a very important step. And I think that's a very precious thing. Otherwise, we'd just be another China.
I'm glad we are coming to that area because if we are talking about that, we'll also have to talk about India's vote at the UN for a watered-down resolution. These are important areas. Should domestic politics at all interfere in determining foreign policy? Have we made a mistake there? Is it happening because the government is weak? Is it happening because of politics? Or is it happening because of individual conviction? We'll get to those areas. They're important. Dr. Brahma Chelani is our next speaker, and he's speaking for the motion of our foreign policy not being in line with our global aspirations. Dr. Chelani.
Mr. Chairpersons, let me begin with a simple fact. India represents 1/6 of the human race, yet it punches far below its weight. By comparison, small South Korea, tiny Israel, and city-state Singapore punch far above their weight. Internationally, India is a rule taker, not a rule maker. Instead of presenting itself as a great power, a world power in the making, India tends to present itself as a subcontinental power with great power ambitions. A recent essay in the leading American journal, Foreign Affairs, aptly summed up how India is its own worst enemy. Under the title, India's Feeble Foreign Policy, the essay described how India is resisting its own rise. One of the reasons why India's foreign policy is out of sync with its global aspirations, with its potential, and with its capabilities is the huge age gap between the leadership and the bulk of the population. If you look at the average age of an Indian political leader and the average age of an Indian citizen, the gap is one of the widest in the world. So Indian foreign policy is not only out of sync with India's global aspirations, it is also out of sync with India. And this is an unfortunate reality. In fact, because of being overly diffident and overly reactive in the absence of a larger strategic blueprint, India's foreign policy is retarding the advance of India's core interests. Now, if you look at the bigger picture globally, the gap in the stature between China and India has grown enormously over the last 50 years, where we were in the 1950s and where we stand today. So the structural limitations of India's foreign policy, as Mr. Thadani, my young friend, very rightly pointed out, those predate the formation of the UPA government. This is not a UPA versus NDA debate, but a larger debate on the structural weaknesses of India's foreign policy and how do we correct those weaknesses. But I think the biggest concern that we should have that regionally, India's space has been shrinking in its own backyard. Our only ally today, literally, is tiny Bhutan. Even Maldives has the gall to kick India in the chin and get away with it. It can kick out the airport operator from India. It can summon and publicly dress down the Indian ambassador without fear of any consequences. In Sri Lanka, India is pretty happy now, apparently, playing second fiddle to China, despite our natural geostrategic advantage and despite our economic and investment clout in that country. We can't bring that country online. And I think if you look at the bigger picture again, a dynamic and a forward-looking foreign policy can make India a bridge builder, a bridge between the East and the West, a bridge between Asia and Europe, a bridge between the developed and the developing worlds. But you can't be a bridge builder through woolly-headed and reactive policies. India has to come out of its traditions of escapism. An India that believes that being soft and being confused, you can't be a great power with poor governance at home, with institutional weaknesses at home, with professional inputs being discarded, and policy-making being increasingly personalized in the hands of 1, 2, or 3 individuals. No country has ever become a great power with such liabilities and limitations.
Well, Dr. Brahma Chelani, I have heard many critiques of this government's policies. You restrict it not just to governments, you restrict it to the center across different political groups. You call it soft, confused, escapist, and if I understand you correctly, an unreal foreign policy. This is the strongest critique I have heard in a long time, but you will have to tell the House on the other side, you'll have to back up your arguments with facts, and I hope you'll do that when we go into the open debate round. Our last speaker, he likes having the last word. G. Parthasarathy is our last speaker against the motion.
Thank you, Arunabh. This is much better than a Times Now debate, because with this young crowd, I'm happy that our future is in safe hands.
That's
because when I was their age, I certainly could not debate at the level which these youngsters are debating. Though at home, my daughters and my grandkids give me a taste of the medicine which one gets here. We're coming basically to, is India's foreign policy in tune with aspirations?
That's right.
I think one should be very clear. One has aspirations and expectations, and on the other side, you have what is achievable. Because ultimately, your influence in the world is determined by what the Chinese call as comprehensive national power, which is political cohesion at home, political unity about what you want, and to deliver that, you need the economic strength. I recall when I visited China with Rajiv Gandhi in 1988, there were nobody on the world stage. But look at the economic progress where it has taken them. It's produced its own problems. But today, they are in a position to supply fighter aircraft, they are in a position to supply nuclear weapons to Pakistan. They are able to invest huge amounts abroad. Economic power is crucial. More important, translating that economic power. I know of projects in Myanmar, which we agreed to in 1993, lying still unimplemented through NDA, UPA, everybody. Do we have the tools to implement our translate economic power into reality? Lastly, military power. And this is crucial because not only have you to defend yourself, but you have to be able to project it beyond your shores. Do you have a defense industry? I mean, let's face it, your public sector ordnance factories can at best turn screwdrivers. They can't produce modern technology. The only success which we have had in defense research is in our missile program, combined, of course, with the nuclear weapons, which is with DAE. But certainly not in producing fighter aircraft or even automatic weapons for use by our army. So this is crucial because when Afghanistan asks us for weapons, there are two aspects to it. One, I am in severe disagreement with this government's policy in not responding positively to that request. It is in our national security interest to do so. But more important, can we produce quality stuff which other countries produce? We can't. We don't have the abilities. Given this framework, I think, transcending governments, we must remember, there is a national consensus on foreign policy. Whenever the country has felt threatened, whether it was 1962, 65, 71, or Kargil, the politicians have stood together. So politician bashing should not be carried beyond a point. Legitimate differences will occur. Now, what have we achieved? What are the centers of power which we are reacting with? One, leave aside China, which I'll deal with separately, is US, Russia, European Union, Japan. And more importantly, in our neighborhood, ASEAN. I think successive governments after liberalization have done a good job in the economic engagement with all these countries. Arunabh, it's not 20 years ago, the only car we could produce, which one a Malaysian told me, was a car which, every part made a noise except the horn. You know what I'm talking about. We've changed, we've moved ahead, we've liberalized our economy, things are moving. And we are much better off. We are a member of G20. That is not an accomplishment of UPA or NDA, it's an accomplishment of the people of India because of the economic growth we've had. So I think that is very important. We are regarded as an economic power by other developing countries, BRICS, ASEAN, IBSA, all these are there. Now, coming to the main problem children, China and Pakistan, I would agree with Brahma, though we're sitting on opposite sides of the table. I am afraid after Indira Gandhi, I have not known a prime minister in India who can put these two countries in their place. In the case of China, for example, I'll give you a classic thing. Why are we unable to supply cruise missiles to Vietnam when China supplies nuclear weapons to us? Why are we not able to deal, China supplies nuclear weapons to Pakistan? Why are we not able to build a stronger and more robust diplomatic military relationship with Japan and the trilateral of Japan, USA, India? Because our defense ministry runs scared of offending the Chinese. How is it that the Chinese walk into Depsang, which since 1693 has been on the Ladakh side of the Ladakh-Tibet border, and we call it an intrusion and we say it's an acne on our chin? So I think, let us be very clear, articulation is important. And with regard to China, we have not used the diplomatic tools which we should be using, and this transcends governments. With regard to Pakistan, yes, obviously we do not want to escalate things into nuclear conflict. But what is the signals you are sending, Arunabh, as you said? The signal you are sending is you kick us where you want, and we'll say everything is hunky-dory, which it is not. Now, you have to have a nuanced policy, and I don't want to go into the details here, of raising the diplomatic and domestic costs to Pakistan for their hostility towards India. That is the only way of dealing with this issue. Yes, by all means, talk to them, engage with them. We have no quarrel with the people of Pakistan. I want our visa procedures to be even more simplified so that people can come here. But I'm sorry, but since Indira Gandhi, I have not met a Prime Minister of India who can deliver that message firmly to Pakistan. Finally, I want to say something with regard to what Tejmi said on Africa. Don't worry. I've been in Africa when the Chinese rushed in and were booted out. The Africans are very sensitive people. The Chinese are exploiting their military resources. We have done the right thing ever since Dr. Kalam, in his larger Africa sweep, said focus on giving them technology, investment, building their capacities. They will get driven out, things will fall in our lap. Lastly, we should not allow our differences with China and Pakistan to come in the way of our larger role. And that will come when we develop our own defense and economic potential. In the Middle East, where we get our oil from, let me say it, we've paid our cards, successive governments, brilliantly. I go back to the decision to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. We are the only country in the world, including the West, which has equally good relations with Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia.
Well, at that point, Mr. Parsati, we'll leave this. You've covered a lot of track, but we'll go into the open debate round. Now, I have found this debate so far very interesting because I find some interesting ideas come up. Mr. Parsati talks about consensus on foreign policy. So I don't know. I haven't seen consensus leave aside on Pakistan and China. Even on Maldives, there is no consensus between political parties.
recently and unfortunately we lost some Indians of Gujarati origin in a terrorist outrage in Nairobi. Do you think India should have sent its forces into Kenya?
Amy, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, sir, that's exactly
Question, if I can interrupt.
that's exactly what I was talking about.
Don't get offended by the reference to Gujarat. I mean, that was inadvertent.
I'm beast about Gujarat.
That the debate so far has focused very little on the subject which is discussed most often in the media and in the public sphere, which is Pakistan. I wonder whether our panelists are shying away from discussing Pakistan openly today. And I would not like that, but I don't think a foreign policy debate will be over without a serious discussion on Pakistan. I wonder, like all Indians do, where does this optimism and implicit faith that some sections have in Pakistan stem from? I am only saying this to provoke the debate. Open debate round, interjections coming in from both sides. Interjections, time for interjections. Interjections from this side, 30 seconds, 1 minute response, and we'll keep it flowing after that. This is the interesting part. You're interjecting whom?
Okay, the first interjection is for Mr. Manish Tiwari. We've been talking about, firstly, as Sauradeep said, our timing is amazing. Our pressure on Pakistan is building up as US is withdrawing from Pakistan. First and foremost, I would like to ask you, sir, that isn't the timing supposed to be relative to India and not relative to America or the global scene? Because we need to put pressure on Pakistan when the 26/11 attacks happen and not when America decides to leave Afghanistan. First thing. Second thing, sir, what I would like to say about what Rachel said is that it's a utopian idea for us to consider that we will be able to protect the Indian diaspora wherever we are. When the Italian Marines come and shoot the fishermen in India, Italy being such a small country, they have the guts to send their diplomat and exert diplomatic pressure over India, and we being such a large country shy away from doing that, and we cannot protect our Indians wherever they are. This is sort of a paradox compared to what our standing is. And another thing that I would like to say is that someone mentioned about how, again, I think it was Rachel who mentioned that a governance in India should be first solving the problems that India has inside of it, like we can't protect Indians inside of India. I think this is where we're failing in demarcating where our foreign policy makers are and where the governors of India are. The people in India need to take care of India, and the people in India also need to take care of the people outside of India, because,
Well,
let me complete.
Let me complete your question very briefly.
Yeah,
you
let me
cover
complete.
too many points, you won't get a quick interjection.
Yeah, so my last point was that our policymakers need to understand that as much as we protect Indians inside of India, that is a problem within India. The internal ministry needs to handle it.
Well,
What is our Ministry of External Affairs doing?
Well, let's Manish Tiwari answer that. Manish.
Well, first of all, I think it's completely erroneous to make any foreign policy debate either Pakistan-centric or China-centric. Having said that, Pakistan's policy towards India, the policy of bleed India with 1,000 cuts, or the K2 or whatever you would like to call it, emanated after we liberated Bangladesh. So therefore, it's been a continuum over the last 30 years. And notwithstanding that continuum, Pakistan has not been able to constrain India either in its growth or in achieving its rightful place in the world. Now, let's step back for a moment and look at this entire problem from a slightly different angle. We have been successfully able to achieve dehyphenation with Pakistan. Pakistan continuously endeavors to re-establish that hyphenation. Is it in India's interest to have that hyphenation back? That's the first question we need to answer. The second question that we need to answer is that vicious foreign policies have a way of recoiling on themselves. And the classical example of that is Pakistan itself, which allowed itself to become a frontline state in the Afghan jihad. And the implications are for everybody to say. The third thing is that we must remember that talking or conversations is not appeasement. The United States of America is an ally of Pakistan. They have huge problems with Pakistan. They found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. They never stopped talking to Pakistan. The European Union is still talking to Syria. The Americans, after 30 years, are talking to Iran again. So therefore, a conversation or negotiations does not mean appeasement. I do not think there should be a confusion between the two. And this knee-jerk reaction that every time there is a terrorist outrage by non-state actors who want to disrupt the tranquility of South Asia, you go into this mode, we'll not talk. And the last thing I would like to say, Mr. Brahmacharya raised the point about, about the region. Allow me to just complete.
The second interjection.
Just allow me to complete. You see, I think somewhere we've gone wrong, Mr. Chelani, on our Monroe Doctrine. The decision that we need to make with regard to our neighborhood is, do we want friends and allies or satellites? The problem is that we've dealt with our neighbors with a big brotherly attitude, and that has only resulted in more problems than solutions.
I request the panelists to respond to the specific interjection which has been made, but interesting formulation Manish Tiwari puts there of a vicious foreign policy. What really would be a vicious foreign policy is a question to add. If the Prime Minister of India equates Pakistan with India as a victim of terrorism, that 2 months after the July train bombings in Mumbai in 2006, would it be vicious for the Prime Minister not to do that? Is a question which is there. And would it be far too assertive and vicious and dangerous for India to speak for national security within its own soil? Is a question people are asking. Ravi Shankar Prasad wants to respond. After that, I'm taking an interjection from this side. You want to respond, sir?
Well, my good friend Manish Tiwari said foreign policy is not punches and counter punches. It's a chess game. I'm sorry, punching and counter punching is an integral part of management of foreign policy. Who is not willing to talk to Pakistan? It is our neighbor. But talk at what level? Not talking at the summit level is also a part of diplomacy. And what we said, let some smaller people talk, not the Prime Minister.
Americans will never speak to any other country at summit level after an attack.
Now let me ask a straight question. Yes, it is very important. It was wrong to say that Pakistan is a victim of terror. It is wrong to say that dialogue will be insulated from the action against terrorism. The problem with Pakistan is who is controlling the military establishment of Pakistan. Are the political leaders or those in the ISI? Unless that remains, yes, they are suffering today, but at least we ought to have exposed them, and summit level talk was completely uncalled for.
Allow me to just respond to that very quickly. Allow me to respond to that very quickly.
I was just completing. I was just completing, or no? Then he can.
I thought you yielded, and he came in.
No, but let him. I'm quite welcome his reply. Since you mentioned about Mr. Bajpayee, you are entitled to mention. After Lahore, if Kargil happened, Pakistan was contained, and then we declared a ceasefire. For 1.5 years, Sir. Agra happened. Agra also failed. Sir. Once Musharraf acknowledged that Sir. Pakistan will not allow its territory to be used against India, only then a further dialogue could take place. But therefore, past is past. But what is important is Pakistan will have to be understood in the context of its hostility. About China also, he has to respond. It is well he can respond that.
I think he wants to respond.
Well, China is not a lonely power. China is an assertive power, is an ambitious power. And China cannot be seen to be pushing India around. And our honorable foreign minister will say in Beijing that Beijing is a lovely city. I'm sorry, that does not give a very right impression. Therefore, China is a neighbor, but China has to be told that India is also different when it comes to shop.
Well, I don't think it's appropriate to make this into a Manish Tiwari versus Ravi Shankar Prasad debate. But allow me to very quickly respond, and which goes back to whether I think it was convergence of thinking between Mr. Goswami and I, which rarely happens, when he started off by referring to Kargil and then, or rather Lahore, Kargil, then the Agra summit and the parliament attack, followed by Operation Parakram, which incidentally blunted the only instrument of coercive diplomacy which was available with us. And then on to the SAARC summit in Islamabad in 2004. And Mr. Chelani, if that wasn't engaging at the summit level, then what else was it?
Okay.
And coming to China, since he raised the question of China.
I'm not
Since,
defending
no, no,
Vajpayee.
I'm not saying that.
Vajpayee.
I'm not talking about Mr. Vajpayee.
fact,
I'm talking about summit level engagement.
Yes,
If
that
this
was
wasn't
wrong.
summit level
That was
engagement,
wrong.
what else was it? And
For that, we are paying we're paying the price for that.
well, I don't think we are paying the price for
Of course
that.
we
The
are.
fact is that that Pakistani territory and a lot of Pakistani territory is unfortunately ungovernable space, which is controlled by non-state actors, which is not really under their
Manish
control.
Tiwari,
That's a reality which we are not willing to
Manish
see.
Tiwari, the gentleman, young man out there, raises his hand for
Friends also
intervention.
asked the question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Mr. Manish Tiwari, you mentioned that the R2P doctrine as a theology is unacceptable to India. Am I right? You said that.
Well, I said two things, R2P and the theology of values in the context of EU, which keeps moralizing. So I said two things.
So the R2P doctrine by itself, you're saying, is not a part of our Indian foreign policy, or it's unacceptable. Well, we can separate the implementation of that doctrine in Libya or wherever. But the doctrine by itself, the term R2P may have been introduced by the Americans, but the very first example, perhaps in world history, of a humanitarian intervention of a military nature was in 1971 in Bangladesh by India. So how can that be unacceptable to India? First question. Second question, speaking of the Maldives, when an Islamist coup took place, and Islamist and Islamic need to be separated as terms, when an Islamist anti-India coup takes place there, and our government is unable to do anything about a pro-India government being displaced, furthermore, they actually remove an Indian company, GMR, from there, and we are unable to act in a tiny country like that. Then, sir, we talked about Sri Lanka as well. The UPA government initially voted against Sri Lanka in the UNHRC. Later, the second time it refused to do so. So what was the change of stance all about? Why are we pandering to a certain section of our Tamil vote bank?
Can I request you? The point is, I know you have a lot of points to make.
One last point,
but
sir.
interventions must be brief. Otherwise, responses
One last
will
point,
be
sir.
longer.
One
I'm
last,
getting a response.
One
So you
last
wait for
point,
points.
sir. One last
Okay,
point.
quickly.
And sir, you confess that we have a big brotherly attitude towards our neighbors. That is a confession coming from you, which helps this side of the motion. Why do we have a big brotherly attitude, and why don't we engage with them on equal terms if we can? Thank you.
Once again, I need to respond. Well, let me do so. You see, the difficulty with the right to protect is that the right to protect has 6 elements. The use of force is the last element. Unfortunately, that gets prioritized first. And in the case of Libya, it was not the most perfect state. But after the intervention in Libya, the kind of sectarian conflict that you find in Libya, I think leaves much to be said about R2P. Now, coming to your second point, which was with regard to Maldives, as to why we are not able to protect our assets even in our neighborhood. I would like to take you back to 1988, when there was a coup d'etat in Maldives, and President Gayoom made a call to late Prime Minister Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, and we intervened and we restored the government of President Gayoom. So therefore, over a period of time, I think we have not calibrated our policies towards our neighborhood in a manner which is nuanced. And coming to Sri Lanka...
Are you therefore accepting the motion?
Well, I'm not accepting the motion. I'm only making
accepting the motion?
See, it's not about accepting or rejecting. It's a statement of reality in terms of calibration of foreign policy. With regard to Sri Lanka, you're absolutely correct. You see, we nuanced our policy. With Sri Lanka, geostrategically is important. We need to engage with them. But yes, where there's an aberration, we need to put our foot down, which is what we did.
If we could be assertive in 1988, why not in 2013? Assertive in 71, why not in 2013? What's changed? I want a call of hands right now. How many in the audience believe that India's foreign policy is not in line with global expectations? I'm just taking a call of hands. That's well over 80%, I think. How many feel it is in line with global expectations? Global aspirations? Well, that's about 10%. So let me just say this, that this side has a lot of work to do, Maruf. How do you look at the debate?
Absolutely.
So far?
In fact, at the cost, I'm going to veer a bit away from Mr. Tiwari because I think all the cannon fire is going on to you. So I give you a bit of a breather. But Mr. Parthasarathi, sir, you've made two points to which I wish to ask you to elaborate a bit more. You've said we have encountered Chinese aggressive activity either on the LOC or in the high seas, i.e. South China Sea, because the Ministry of Defense is on the back foot or too passive. But as far as I understood, our policy towards China is by and large handled by the Foreign Office. The MOD, even on the LOC, is restricted to a great deal by the MEA, and the MEA takes credit for the fact that we don't fire shots on the LAC like we fire shots on the LOC. What's your response?
Look, ultimately, right now on this issue, the MOD is ahead of MEA on these trilateral exercises. But generally speaking, Maruf, you know, we have to be very, very clear. There has to be a policy of engagement to go in hand with policy and policy of hand in hand with a policy of containment. I mean, China is containing us, for God's sake. All I am saying is that in paying back China in its own coin, whether it is our relations with Vietnam, the inhibitions with which we have been moving towards Japan, the whole thing of having a trilateral with the United States in this, to me is totally defensive and counterproductive. China has to be responded to not aggressively, but assertively.
Okay. Okay, one second. Let's get the next interjection in right now. Let's get the panelists in. Let's accept one fact on this debate. Everyone's bungled big time. I agree. Let's not make it a UP-NDA debate because I can take pot shots at anyone. Let's remember, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, how you bungled big time during Kargil. I don't like reminding you about it. I really don't want to. And I'm sure you also don't like to be reminded about it.
I differ with you, but I will keep quiet
But I remember
for the sake of this debate.
that George Fernandez was the then defense minister. He made an initial statement saying Nawaz Sharif and the ISI were not in know of the intrusions. And then he had to clarify his statement. So the point here is we don't do the tough talking. There seems to be
I want to clarify one thing.
There seems to be.
It is very important on Pakistan. Indian elite and political parties have grossly misread Nawaz Sharif. He was briefed by the GHQ, he was
Precisely,
briefed by...
Mr.
And today, he is a greater ally of the Lashkar-e-Taiba than the army.
Precisely, and which is why today I said this earlier, that I want to know the need for our implicit and undying faith in the Pakistani state. We have a question from Sauradeep on this side. Go ahead, Sauradeep.
My question is to Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad. In your introduction, you said that our policy vis-a-vis our neighbors hasn't been particularly good. You mentioned Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Pakistan. What you didn't mention is Bangladesh, where I think the BJP is currently blocking the land boundary agreement, which would be a landmark achievement. Now, my question is this. Even if we are giving away 10,000 acres to Bangladesh, how does it really matter when the question is about the citizenship rights of 52,000 people living in no man's land, when the NDA government had identified that human life trumps all other values when you negotiated with terrorists in Kandahar to save Indian citizens? My question is, if the opposition sabotages foreign policy purely for political gain, how is it legitimate to then criticize?
Who's playing politics, BJP or Mamta? Good point. From Sauradeep to Ravi Shankar Prasad.
I'm happy you have asked me this question. We are all keenly concerned that we must have good relations with Bangladesh. But you must understand that this exchange of enclave is the last option available with us. Last option. When we are pursuing that, are we getting three clear assurances from Bangladesh? Number one, that they will not promote terrorism against India in cohort with ISI on the soils of Bangladesh, which is not a case presently. The present government is good, but there is no formal agreement. Number two, the large-scale infiltration of Bangladesh people into India, which has been commented also by the Supreme Court, is it going to be completely stopped? Is it going to stop completely? You must understand that foreign policy is what? We have created Bangladesh, we have love and respect for Bangladesh. But when you are going to do so, at least there must be proper commitment in place to ensure that these allied problems do not arise. That's point number one. Point number two is, we are not opposed in principle, but we are saying, take the consent of the people of Bengal, the leaders particularly, all the party, and also Assam, which are going to be seriously impacted. That's all we have said. We are not opposed in principle as far as the agreement is concerned.
Okay, one sec. Count. No, one sec. We're not. I'm letting in a counter interjection come in, but it's coming from Rajul to this side. Rajul.
I'd just like to respond to Thami, who raised a couple of questions about what I said earlier about the Indian diaspora. You're talking about protecting people everywhere, fine, but what about Sri Lanka? I think it's pretty much universally accepted that our creation of the LTTE was one of the biggest mistakes we made. At the same time, would you say that it's all right to kill Tamils or not kill Tamils when they are killing the Sinhalese government? I mean, we have to take into account the fact that Indians will also behave in a certain way in certain situations, and India as a country cannot just say that these people are ethnically the same race as us, and therefore we are bound to protect them, no matter what their political views or stance. If they're promoting terror, I think all countries have a responsibility to act against terror. Moreover, I'd just like to include this. I'd like to add to Mr. Brahmachalani, and I'd like to ask him a question. When you're talking of Maldives and how they can give us a kick in the face and get away with it, I don't think India is trying to create an environment of fear. I mean, we're trying to get along with our neighbors. It's not a question of whether they can get away with insulting us. It's not a question of trading insults here, which is what seems to be happening here a bit between the UPA and the NDA.
Dr. Raijul asked the question to Brahma Chalani and Tehmi, and I think they should have the first right to respond to this. Tehmi first, and then Brahma Chalani. Dr. Chalani, the young man has accused you of pugilism, and you need to respond to him straight after that. Tehmi, go ahead.
Yeah, so first thing about the LTTE thing, we're not just talking about specifically in Sri Lanka, though we concede the fact, but what we are talking about is the protection of the Indian diaspora everywhere, because we know, as Mr. Tiwari mentioned, there are 6 million Indian origin expats in the Middle East. So when our foreign policy should be such that we should know when which measure is required. Just in answer to that, you just mentioned Maldives. Either we are talking about playing a big brother and undermining the importance of everyone else, or we'll just completely shift when our the power balance is not in our favor. Just one sec, let me finish that. When the power balance is not in our favor, we will completely become timid, and we will act as a soft kitten, and we're not going to put any diplomatic pressure anywhere. What we need to find, our foreign policy needs to be such, our foreign policy needs to be such that we find a balance, a critical balance between being an oppressor and being a diplomat.
That's precisely the point, and haven't we found that balance?
Brahma Chalani, please.
May I just ask her a question? You know, you make a very interesting point. Recently and unfortunately, we lost some people, some Indians of Gujarati origin in a terrorist outrage in Nairobi. Do you think India should have sent its forces into Kenya? And do you think that Kenya should have stopped talking to Sudan, which they didn't do, because the Al-Shabaab terrorists came from Sudan?
Tehmi, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, sir, that's exactly...
question, if I can interrupt.
That's exactly what I was talking about.
Don't get offended by the reference to Gujarat. I mean, that was inadvertent.
I'm least about Gujarat.
Don't be so sensitive.
Manish, least about Gujarat. I was saying loaded question for her, but go ahead.
Tehmi, I think you're getting covering fire from the deputy leader of the opposition, whereas you are completely capable of replying on your own. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sir, that's exactly what I was talking about, that when Indian origin people in Nairobi are killed, we do not immediately send our troops inside, because that is a foreign policy failure. We need to find a better way of putting diplomatic pressure and trying to enforce safety of Indians wherever they are. This is what I'm talking about. Either we talk about pushing forces inside, or we take a complete backstep and not respond at all. We need to find a middle way.
Okay, now we are getting into counter questions. Ravi Shankar Prasad had a question on this side. You had a question, you said?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, Mr. Parsati, I have a question to you. Why a country of the size of India not using its economic might in the pursuit of management of foreign policy? There is a lot of Chinese investment in India. China needs those investment. China needs India's market. Vice versa. Indians are also there in business. Why this economic instrument is not being properly used and exploited as far as pursuit of India's interests is concerned?
I think there are two issues in this. One is the core security area, which is our communications. The Chinese presence in our communications sector is dangerous for national security.
I totally agree with you.
We allow
Dangerous.
them in.
But the fact of the matter is that post-liberalization, we have left the electronics industry to languish here. Only now has the National Manufacturing Council come up with proposals to develop even a semiconductor manufacturing capability in this country. But we should resist American pressures on this. We should resist Chinese pressures. When it comes to building strategic industries, whether defense, whether communications, I will go and have supper with the devil if I have to do it for my country.
Okay, Mr. Patsati, now 1 second. Maruf, please.
Well, sir, I just want to bring out a couple of points. One is in response to a point that Rajul made earlier. You said the first issue was about Sri Lanka. You said, should we intervene every time something happens in Sri Lanka? I mean, basically, we're talking of military force. But we'd lost an opportunity in Sri Lanka when they offered us the first opportunity to build the Hambantota port. And we allowed the Chinese to come in and then...
Sri Lanka, when we did send in the IPKF.
Pardon me?
We also did goof up in Sri
Yeah,
Lanka
well,
when we intervened at the long
IPKF
time.
was 87, Hambantota port was 2 decades later. The point at issue is that you went into Sri Lanka with the IPKF, and Mr. Parthasarathi is a veteran of that time, but the fact of the matter is that we completely misread the situation. Having done that, how Sri Lanka has handled the insurgency, but looking at the economic dimension, we missed out there. We missed out even an opportunity that came up in Burma, Myanmar. Once again, both occasions.
But
our
for
Foreign
example,
Office-
we are collaborating with Iran on the Chabahar port. So I mean,
Chabahar
one can
port is
always.
Chabahar port. But anyway, going back to the other point, Mr. Tiwari. Now, this is the question for
May I
you.
come in for a moment? Sorry to interrupt. But you know, the interesting thing on Myanmar is that when the relief operation after Cyclone Nargis took place, the only security forces which were allowed into Myanmar were Indian security forces. And that is because of the sterling work which Mr. Parthasarathi and his colleagues did from 1993 onwards to build that trust with Myanmar. I think
Yes,
that was...
I want to,
Indeed.
let's go back
But-
to the interjection round. We have more interjections coming in from this side. Mr.
on a
Please, one
just-
second, Maruf, one second.
I need half a minute here.
Brahma Chalani hasn't yet got
I
a
need
chance
half
to
a minute
respond.
here just to say that we don't always differ in foreign policy.
Well, I'm
as
sure
far as
you don't.
Myanmar is concerned, Mr. Tiwari has a very
I'm
valid
sure you
point.
don't.
In containing many of the extremist elements active in Northeast, even the military government of Myanmar has done a very good job in protecting India's interests.
How can you have one approach when it comes to domestic compulsions with some neighbors, but on Pakistan, I want to know which prism we are looking at the whole issue through.
When India was weak economically in the 1970s and 1980s, no neighbor of India would dare to mess with India, right? How is it that today, when we are so much stronger economically and also militarily, that small neighbors and the two known adversaries have stepped up their pressures on India? Why?
On 3 different occasions, we have allowed our foreign policy to be dictated by domestic considerations. Tista, Bangladesh, the border agreement with Bangladesh is number 2, and the UN vote on Sri Lanka, right? How on earth can we then say we should not let domestic compulsions affect our relationship with Pakistan? Why are we being so hypocritical? Domestic compulsions affected our handling of these 3 issues. Can we have an honest answer from this house? How can you have one approach when it comes to domestic compulsions with some neighbors, but on Pakistan, I want to know which prism we are looking at the whole issue through. Do we have interjections of Mr. Brahma Chalani was accused of, I think, pugilism and over-aggression by the young man on the other side? Would like to respond to it.
When India was weak economically in the 1970s and 1980s, no neighbor of India would dare to mess with India, right? How is it that today, when we are so much stronger economically and also militarily, that small neighbors and the two known adversaries have stepped up their pressures on India? Why? And again, it's a structural issue. It's not who is in government today. Many countries are pursuing strategies pivoted on balance of power or balance of interest or balance of threat. Our foreign policy is not organized on the basis of any distinct strategic doctrine. Now, if you look at any successful company in the world, it has clear strategic goals. What is China's main strategic goal? To be number 1, both in soft power and in hard power. What is America's number 1 goal strategically? To remain the world's preeminent power. Now, if somebody were to ask you, or ask anybody, any Indian, what is India's overarching strategic aim today? What would you say? Actually, the best description of India comes from India's tourism ad campaign slogan, Incredible India. India is incredible in every respect. It is the only important democracy in the world with no defined foreign policy, no articulated defense policy, no declared counterterrorism policy, and no enunciated national security strategy. In other words, India is incredible in every sense. Now, if India wants to be a world power, it'll have to transform itself from being incredible India to being a credible India. We need a credible India.
Okay. Soradeep is responding. Soradeep, well said, Soradeep.
And for that, you need credible leadership too. That's equally important for credible India.
Which is not tired or retired.
Dr. Chelani, if I were to look at the geopolitical situation currently, what I would say India's broad foreign policy goal is to recognize the constraints we function under and then develop as many pragmatic strategic relationships as we can so that although we may not compete against China and USA in terms of numbers, we can compete with them in terms of being better off as being Indians as opposed to being Chinese or Americans. And that I say in terms of living in a democracy, working with all the constraints and still managing to debate the issue on the floor of this house and managing to say that we are still better, at a certain stage economically, that we can care for
Audience questions. The first audience question from Dhempi College is Kanchana. I think she's here. Kanchana has a question.
Sir, India is a huge, huge market for companies in the defense sector. That puts us in a very good bargaining position. My question to you is, take for example MMRC, Rafale deal and all. Why is it that it is not going anywhere? Why is it that, isn't it a foreign policy failure because we are not able to guarantee our national security in the military sense? What is your response to that?
The response is constrained because I'm in government, but in the February of 2011, I had written a piece for one of the newspapers making a very persuasive case for opening up the Indian defense industry. And as we speak, I think we have taken baby steps in that direction. As of today, there is foreign direct investment, 26% plus, which means all the way up to 100%, which is allowed with CCS approval. And the classical case in point is the collaboration with Russia on the BrahMos missile program, where the Russians have 49% equity in that program. So therefore, I think you're right. There is a strong case for building an indigenous defense manufacturing infrastructure, which is not only able to absorb India's creative potential, create a manufacturing base, but more importantly, allow us to punch to our weight.
Right. And next audience question from Josh Prakash Majumdar from Jadavpur University.
My question is specifically to Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad. Sir, you had a heated discussion with Soradeep with the domestic politics in Bangladesh, and you said that India has to become a regional power to become a superpower one day. Now, my question is, if I talk about India's foreign policy in recent times, I have to talk about UPA's foreign policy. Now, sir, India has been for 1 decade or 2 decades in a coalition government. Now, we see this uprising of regional parties, and regional parties are interfering with national policies and also international policies. But they have no stake in national matters, forget about international matters. So, sir, the UPA government has suffered criticism from the NDA. Now, my question to you is, if the NDA had to take a stance, what would your stance be in the debate between federalism and national interest? Because if you follow a federal policy, you have to give the states importance, but your national interest will suffer. Now, if you go into national interest, then you have to ignore the states and go ahead.
I think your presumption is wrong, because there is an assumption underlying your query that those who are regional powers are not concerned about national interest. That is a very, very wrong assumption to make. But having said that, I'm willing to go the extra mile with you. That in the case of many regional political parties, their state interests become important. But after all, persuasion, dialogue, consensus is a part of democracy. And the leadership does play a role.
So did I just hear you? Are you dodging the question? Are you dodging the question?
No, I'm not dodging the question at all. I'm only saying...
If you had Mamta as an ally and if you had Jayalalitha as an ally, they took a certain position, you'd break off with them?
No, I would tell you, since you asked me this question, let me be very specific to you. In the parliament, many of the parties from Tamil Nadu rise and say, please declare Sri Lanka as an enemy country. We stand up, I stood up and say, no, Sri Lanka is not an enemy country. There are issues we have to address. This is how you take a position. Surely in the case of the treaty with Bangladesh also you mentioned about, we have taken that position that India's concerns need to be addressed. But a larger issue which you said, that federal principle and national interest are coming in the way, sorry, I don't think.
Okay. I'm going to the young man in the last row, please. Yes, go ahead.
So Mr. Tiwari said that we need to get along with our neighbors. But it's safe to assume that till the time Kashmir is on the map of India, Pakistan will be in no mood to get along with India. So do you not think that a soft policy towards Pakistan and the disparity between our statements and our actions, when we say that we have no regular business with Pakistan but then go on to have a bilateral meeting with them, allows Pakistan to use it to the strategic advantage in terms of exporting terror and continuing to violate ceasefire agreements along the LOC?
While the 1998 Pokhran tests worked to a strategic advantage, and I think the NDA government did well by carrying out those tests, but the reality is that it froze the power balance in South Asia into perpetuity. Pakistan first tried to exploit that nuclear shield by attempting an intrusion in Kargil. They were foiled. And subsequently, there has been this continuous export of terror. The reality is that is a situation which we have to live with, which we have to surmount, and which we have to deal with. And if you look at it in a perspective between 2005 and 2013, I can go even further back, the fact is that notwithstanding the Mumbai outrage, which was reprehensible, by and by, we have been able to contain the designs of Pakistan by limiting the damage which they have been able to inflict on India. And I don't want to go into the issue of counter damage.
Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad wanted to respond.
Nawaz Sharif is the Prime Minister. His own younger brother Shahbaz Sharif is the Chief Minister of Punjab. And the government of Punjab is giving fund to Jamaat Dawa, which is nothing but the benign name of Lashkar-e-Taiba. Mr. Hafiz Saeed holds a big rally in the Gaddafi Stadium of Lahore, where all the anti-India utterances are made in the most virulent form. Why could not government of India tell Nawaz Sharif point blank that unless your brother, who is not a military man, stops this funding, no engagement will be possible? I think this could have been done just
Fairly
2 days
pointed.
ago, 3 days ago.
Fairly pointed.
Ravi, with all due respects to you, you are deputy leader of the opposition in the Rajya Sabha. How do you presume that it wasn't said? And the second thing which I want to tell you, which is equally interesting,
you
is...
to say that despite that message being conveyed, and despite...
Allow me to complete, Mr. Chelani. Allow me to complete.
Despite the message being spurned.
Allow me to complete.
Despite the message being spurned, we proceeded with the summit meeting.
Allow me to complete. The fact,
this is really an amazing statement.
The fact is that messages to Pakistan or messages to any country in diplomatic parlance go out at multiple levels. And the point that you made, about why don't we deal with Pakistan in the manner in which Pakistan deals with us, or deal with China in the manner in which Pakistan is dealing with us, the short response to that is that India does not believe in exporting terror. And India does not believe in non-proliferation. So therefore, the implicit subtext of your question
I think
is absolutely erroneous. And now
Mr. Tiwari,
coming
Maruf
back,
wants to make a point from the chair.
Maruf
wants to make a point from the chair.
That was the implicit subtext of the
Maruf, please,
question.
1 second. Let's
Come
listen.
on, this is an absurd reply. I'm sorry, Manish.
Come on, but that
Mr.
is
Tiwari and
completely
Mr.
absurd.
This is, you're just top of the head.
No, but what did you mean by saying that we should deal with China in the manner in which Pakistan deals with us?
Well, let me answer that.
So
Let me just answer that.
Either you should have amplified on that.
Diplomacy can be only effective if it's backed up by economic and political leverage. That's a very basic premise on which diplomacy is founded. And an assertive diplomacy does not mean using terrorism as a tool of statecraft. For heaven's sake, I did not say, India should repay Pakistan in the same coin. There are multiple ways. One minute. There are multiple ways for India to exercise leverage vis-a-vis Pakistan. Unfortunately,
I would like Maruf to come in at this stage. This debate, otherwise it'll be a bilateral exchange.
But if I could just make one last point, Maruf, just one last point. There's a tendency in India for people to think at two extremes. It's either appeasement or all-out war. And I think this tendency in India to think only at extremes snuffs out all the possible options in between.
Right.
And we should stop thinking in extremist lines.
Right.
These are not just two options that we have. There are more than 100 options in between that we have to explore and pursue.
Mr. Chelani, Maruf.
Mr. Tiwari, I just want to sort of further take up to Brahma's point, and that is that if you think Pakistan only exports terror, then clearly you also by inference admit that Pakistan is the epicenter of terror, and therefore there is no other room for diplomatic talks or maneuver with Pakistan. So why are you talking to Pakistan?
Well, I think the answer to that is very clear. Jamaat Dawa was designated as a terrorist entity at the instance of India by the United Nations after 26/11. The reality is also that there are elements in Pakistan and responsible elements not only in civil society but in the democratic mainstream who do not believe in the policies which are being pursued by the establishment. So therefore, your engagement with Pakistan essentially will have to be at multiple levels. At one level, there would have to be an engagement in terms of trade and commerce. At another level, you will also have to put in place measures, which of course any government does, to ensure that non-state actors or non-state actors who are supported by elements of the Pakistani establishment do not continue with the activities they are. And let me assure you, and you are aware of that since you're the strategic editor of Times now, that all these instruments in the diplomatic kit bag are being utilized.
Are we punching below our weight is the question Maruf raises, taking off from what Brahma Chelani said. Tehmi, your closing comments.
Definitely we're punching below our weight, far below our weight, as I would like to put it, is because there's, as we previously discussed, there are many layers to diplomatic engagement, and I do not see the reason why, considering our history with the NDA government and Kargil, our prime ministers have talks and Pakistan brazenly ignores them and goes on with its terrorist activities. Why does our prime minister need to engage with the Pakistani prime minister? Why doesn't this happen on other levels? Yep. Because the Pakistani prime minister comes out with things like saying, I've even discussed Balochistan, that's tender topic for India, but then India fails to get any response from Pakistan at all.
How many of us at the end of this debate believe that our foreign policy is in line with our global aspirations? As in against the motion? That's a tiny majority. How many of you believe that it's not in line with our global aspirations? I hope everyone on the other side, including the minister and all the other speakers, take that voice back with them. Thank you very much for joining us on this Youth Parliament. Thank you very much indeed.